All right, what's going on here? And why does it matter to you? I set the context and I told you that David, we've been following the trajectory of his life, and he's anointed by rights. He should be the top man in charge. But Saul says, nope. And in his jealousy, he goes out into the wilderness where David has been driven. David is away from home, comfort, security. He's out in the wilderness, and Saul says, I'm going to go get him, kill him. And there comes a point where David takes the spies and he goes into the encampment. And if you know how the military slept at that time, what they did was they would put the king in the middle. And everybody's around him as a way to say, we'll protect him. And his spear is near his head so he can grab it and have quick reflexes if somebody were to attack him in the night. And David gets right up next to him. And Abishai is a trained warrior, his colleague here. And he says, give me a shot. I'll take him down. It's as if Abishai was to say, David, look, I know all the things he's done to you. I know how mean he's been to you. I know that he's threatened your life. I know that he's run you out of the city. Now you got him. You can put your foot on his throat. You can vanquish him, extinguish him, wipe him out, get rid of him. You can get yours, David. It goes even further in verse 13. It says that they brought up upon a deep sleep into Saul and the men. And this is an idiom to say this. The Lord's basically saying, y'all ain't waking up until I want you to. David had every strategic advantage to give out revenge. Nobody was going to know, and nobody could stop him. And he shows mercy. Mercy to his greatest enemy. Mercy to the guy who's bad-mouthing him. Mercy to the guy who rats him out. Mercy to the guy who says, I'm going to go get him. And I don't think I have to push it much further for you to think of people in your life, maybe now or maybe before, who've done this to you, who've wronged you, who've disparaged you, who said, I'm out to get you. You're going down. I want you to see this and how magnificently awe-inspiring this is. David has his enemy literally on the ground. Stamp him out. Kill him. Saul deserved it. You know all the stuff Saul did to David? David says, how dare I do that? Get you thinking. Is David just a really, really good guy? Is he just nice? He's got a good heart? No. Maybe, but that's too simplistic. You got to dig into the story a little bit to see mercy being shown to the enemy who wants to take you down. And it's not easy. It's borderline impossible to try it alone. But David taps into something that I never got. I never understood it, and I don't even know if I can apply it right now, although I'm going to try with you. We'll do this evening. We'll walk along and see what the gospel of grace says and how it gives you and me the power to show mercy to the people who have wronged us the most. Saul had wanted to destroy him. You ever have any coworkers like that? Saul had wanted to embarrass David. You ever have any classmates like that? All of us at one point or another find ourselves in the crosshairs of somebody. And the answer that David gives is one of the most beautiful, nuanced, complex ways to show mercy. He doesn't just say, Saul gets away with it scot-free. You'll see this in a little bit. But he also doesn't say, I got the spear. Let me stick it in his head. The way that you and I often like to do for others. Let me put it under this. First, 3 things about mercy that you have to see in this story this evening. The start of it. What does it look like? The cost of it. And the power for it. The start. It shows a scene, and I'm going to put it this way. I think I said this in your outline. You can follow along. The start of mercy The very start of the ability for you and me to show mercy to the ones who least deserve it and the ones who've wronged us the most is the ability, first and foremost, to see them as they are. To see them in the image of the way God made them. Let me explain what I mean. Look at this. We said, David's a fugitive. David's on the lam. And Saul comes to him, and Saul has been the bad guy. David hasn't done anything wrong. He hasn't done anything to deserve the ire of Saul. If anything, it's the people who sang that song. If you were here last week, they say David has slain his tens of thousands. It's the people who get Saul mad. David hasn't done anything at this point, and yet he's hunted. And he sees Saul in his moment of weakness. And I'm sure some of you, if you can think about people in your life who've wronged you, you want them in this moment when they're asleep and the spear's next to their head. They're good for the taking. You can bring them down. And David relents. Why? He gives the answer, and it's a rather theological one. Look, he says, I can't touch the Lord's anointed. Think about that. Saul's not the anointed one anymore. David is. David had every right to go, God's got my corner, stamp him out. But David looks at Saul, and he sees something about Saul. And he sees something about the human condition. He says, he was the Lord's anointed. The Lord picked him at one time. At one time, the Lord saw fit to choose this guy. How dare then I exact mercy on him? You know what David's starting to do? He's starting to see what we learn in Genesis. He's recognizing the theological point, and this is this. He knows Saul, like him and like everybody else, is made in the image of God. And he has profound respect for that. You see, and trust me, I know this. I've had people who wronged me in my life. It's easy to characterize them, isn't it? It's easy to villainize them. It's easy to demonize them. And I'm not going to tell you today, let them scot off the hook. No. This is not some Pollyanna, nice Christianity where you just pat him on the head and say, go about your merry way. No, you're going to have to hold him to account. But do you see what David's starting to do? He said to Abishai, how can I touch this guy? He was chosen by God at one point too. He's just like me. What he starts to do is he starts to recognize what happened in Genesis in the garden. Do you remember what God says? Let him make us in our image. It's this theological concept that we have where we call it the image of God. We're made in the image. Isn't that nice? I tell you this afternoon, you are made in the image of God, and you look at me and say, Pastor, what does that mean? And I look back at you and I say, I don't know. People have wrestled it. People who are much smarter than me wrote books about it, and they still unpack it all the time. What does it mean that you and me and your neighbor and that guy and the person who wronged you, that we're all made in the image of God? What does it mean? I don't know, but at the very least it means this. It means that the person who wronged you bears the image of the one who made you. And David starts to see this. He has every right. And Abishai, his friend, says, give me one shot. All I need is one, and I can take him out. You deserve it, David. David says, how can I? He's made just like me. He was anointed. He was chosen once. At one point, David would say, God looked at Saul and said, he's my creation. So David has recognized that, and he has immense respect for it. Why? And look, here's the start. Here's the start to mercy. It's just the start. The start of mercy begins when you can look at the one who wronged you and say, he's my neighbor. She's made in the image of the one who made me. And it'll start to reshape the way you look at them. It'll start to reshape your need to get revenge. Why does David relent? He says he was the one who was anointed. He too is made in the image of God. What it means is you start to do this. You start to look at people and you start to do good to them, not because of their merits, but because of their image. Let me rephrase that, or say it again. It means that you start to look at people, especially the people who wrong you in life the most, and you start to judge them not on their merits, which is what David should have done to Saul. Saul deserved it. David says not on his merits, but on his image. He was anointed. God made him the same way. Let me push it further. How do you look at people? How are we meant to look at people? What's the image that you have of someone? And I said before, If somebody wrongs you, it's easy to villainize them, and I know. And if somebody does something bad to you, they ruin your reputation, or they try to drive you to the wilderness like David is. How easy is it for you to demonize them? David doesn't take the bait because he sees the blessed anointing that God has given Saul. And he says, look at the image. He's a child of God, just as I am, he would say. C.S. Lewis, in one of the quotes that I like the most, is saying this, and I've read it before. I'll read it again. It's a good one. The Weight of Glory. He says, look, basically this. How are you going to look at somebody and see them as glorious? Especially when they wrong you. He says, it is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. He pushes and he says, all day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, is with the awe and the circumcision proper to them, that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another. All friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as that of a light of a gnat, but it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. It is with immortals, he says, that you work with. Do you see them in that image? And more importantly, can you start to see the people who've wronged you the worst in that image? God made them just as he made you. Now, that's the start. There's a cost, though. When you show mercy to someone who's wronged you the worst, there's a cost to pay for that. And David does it. David has the chance, remember, to strike down his enemy. And what's his reply? In verse 10, if you look back, it says, as David says, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. You know what he's saying, translation? It's not my choice what happens to him. David's saying it's not my obligation, it's not my duty to exact revenge on him. God's got it covered, not me. He knows what Saul deserves. He knows it. And he lets him off. He shows incredible mercy to his enemy, but listen, here's the cost of it. You know what would have happened? Abishai says, let me kill him. Get done with him. Your enemy, your mortal enemy, once and for all. And David says, nope. How dare I? God loves him just the same way he loves me. And the minute that David does that, you know that he's militarily weak? The moment that David relents from the life of Saul, his life is now forfeit. He's in the middle of the camp. He's surrounded by the enemy army. And he says, I'm not going to lift my hand. The implication of that is his life is now on the line. There's a cost to mercy. It's going to cost you something. It's going to be painful for you to pay it down for other people. It will. Look at David. He's paying it down in the ultimate way. David knows if I don't kill him, then I could be killed. And he says, okay, mercy for my enemy. See, if you were here a couple weeks ago, or last week, you heard the story of Jonathan and the friendship that he has with David. And a lot of commentators point out, they ask the question, why would David go into the middle of the camp? Why would he take the risk and the challenge to go there and then not do anything about his enemy? It's preposterous, it's stupid, it's ludicrous, it's foolish, it's weak, and it's vulnerable. And David, more than other people, would have known what that felt like because his friend Jonathan was vulnerable for him first. Last week I said this. Jonathan stands up for David in the court to his own daddy Saul. He says, "Daddy Saul, don't kill David." And the minute Jonathan does that, his life is on the line for his friend. Now David is in the middle of the camp and he has every right to kill his enemy, but he says, I won't. And his life is forfeit. There's a story, a parable that Jesus gives a long time later on about people who owe debts, and some of you probably know this. From the book of Matthew in chapter 18, and there's debts that are forgiven by servants, and then there's one servant who says, "No, I'm not going to forget the debt." And then the master says, "Wait a second, I forgave you your debt. How can you not forgive that person their debt?" And it says the person who forgave the first debt did it out of pity. And it's this interesting phrase. It's kind of gross. Here's vivid body imagery for you. It means out of the bowels. Isn't that gross? It means in the deep pit of the stomach. The person could look at the other person who owed them everything and say, "I forgive you. No debt here. Move on." Jesus gives this parable as a way to say, listen, if God has forgiven you of so much, how can you not forgive them? If God has shown mercy on you, how can you not show it to them? And David, that sounds great, I know. In abstraction, it sounds great. In 5:15, that might not make much sense to you right now. Come back and listen. Because David knew it firsthand. He saw the mercy that Jonathan gave to him. He had experienced mercy, so then he could give it back out. And David knew that if Jonathan was willing to risk his life for their friendship, then David surely could risk his life to save even his mortal enemy who's lying on the ground. Mercy means never bringing it up again. It would have hurt. David was the anointed one. And I said, I'm not going to tell you this evening, give me a couple minutes, or I'm not going to tell you that everybody who wrongs you in life, please listen to this, take this home if you want to play it on like loop if you can. I'm not saying that when people wrong you, you just smile and say, okay, give me more. That's not what David does. He says, I won't kill him, but he takes his spear. The symbolism of this is incredibly rich. You know what he's doing? He's taking the very weapon that Saul would have used against him, and he says, I won't let you use it against me anymore. You can't hurt me the way you've done in the past. He doesn't just say, Saul, pat you on the head, give you some milk, go back to sleep, all's good in life, go on your merry way. He takes the spear, and he goes up to the high place, and there's this interesting interchange with him and Abner, who was supposed to be protecting Saul. And David shouts out. He goes to the high place with the spear. It's almost as a way of saying, David says, look, you were trying to kill me with this. And I could have killed you with this. But nobody's doing any killing today. You see how magnificent this is? You see how complex and nuanced this is? David doesn't just walk away in the night and say, Saul, go about your merry way. He takes the very weapon of Saul's pain that Saul was unleashing on him. Remember, Saul had thrown that spear at David a few other times before. And David said, I'll pick it up and you will not hurt me with this anymore. I take the spear away from you, but in mercy, I love you. And it cost. It cost a whole lot. David puts his life on the line for the guy who wanted to kill him. David puts his reputation on the line for the guy who badmouthed him. Isn't that sound nice? How do you get the power to do something that ludicrous? It is ludicrous. And I built it up to this point, and I've been belaboring it and pushing it because I hope you look at me, and I hope you're thinking about this right now, and you can roll your eyes, and I'll read your body language if you're thinking this. You're thinking, this is impossible. You're telling me to go very close to the people who hurt me the most. And you're telling me to not stamp them out. And you're telling me then to take away the things in which they've been used to hurting me and to forgive them and to show mercy. How? How? Go back to verse 17. David gives you part of the answer. David looks at Saul and he says, my Lord, O King. That's incredibly weird. Think about this. David was supposed to be the king. David had the power. David had the military might. David had the vote of the popular people. David should have said to Saul, you go to the wilderness. You little pitiful, poor wretch of a man. You get going. But he looks at him, he says, my Lord, my king. In the moment of ultimate revenge, when David by rights has every chance to put the spear in the back of his head, he calls him his king. He abdicates. He loses power. He doesn't abdicate fully because he will be the king later on. But what he's, in essence, this is a profound statement you have to see. This is all of David's friends. Oh, by the way, if you were with David and you were in the encampment and you were Abishai, you would have looked at him and said, say, what? 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 That doesn't make no sense, David. What are you doing? You're the king. He's not. Kill him. And David says, my Lord, my king, when Saul talks to him. He lets it go. He releases power. David had all the might. He had every right to just get rid of Saul at the moment, and Saul deserved it. David says he's made, he's anointed, and he goes even so far as to say, my king, I'll put you higher than me. You came into the wilderness to kill me. I'll elevate you above my needs and wants and desires. And he says, I could have killed you, but I loved you. And after all this, after this grand narrative, Saul says, I'm sorry. In verse 21, Saul says, I've sinned. So that's another way to say I'm sorry. Why does Saul say that? Does he say, I'm sorry, David, because you're stronger than me? No. Does he say, David, I'm sorry because you proved me wrong? No. Does he say, David, I'm sorry because you're smarter and better than me? No. He's melted. Saul is. By the aggressive forgiveness of David. Because at this point in the narrative, David is still holding the spear. Did you know this? He doesn't give it back to Saul. He's still holding it. He could kill him, but he doesn't. And in this profound, wonderful, stupid, ludicrous act of mercy, the heart of Saul is melted. And he says, David, you see me and you see preciousness. What's going to melt your enemies? What's going to get them to say sorry? You can take the spear. And I know many of you felt like this. When somebody wrongs you, you can go into the camp when they're asleep. You can go find them in their weakest moment. You can expose their weakness. You can find out all the juicy gossip about them and tell everybody in public. You can do it. You can pick up the spear and drive it in their head. Or you can do David. Mercy. Forgiveness for your enemy. Because you look at their life and you see them as precious. What's the power as I close? What's going to give you the power to do that for another person? It sounds all great, doesn't it? And you say, Pastor, this is great. And I'm telling you, I haven't figured this out in my life totally yet. I'm still working on it. But what's going to make you and me look at the enemy and say, you're precious? And what's going to make them look back at you and say, thank you for seeing me as precious? You will only see someone else as precious in as much as you know that someone has looked at you first and seen you as precious, as beautiful. In Isaiah 53, it says, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. By his scourging we are healed. Look at this. David is standing over his enemy, and he doesn't strike back. There's someone else who came along much later in 1 Peter. It says, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats. Who are they talking about? David was driven out to the wilderness and tested. Matthew 4 tells us that there was another person who was driven out to the wilderness unfairly, and he was tested. David entrusted the ultimate judgment to God. He looked at his enemy and says that the Lord knows what to do with him, not me. He'll figure it out. There's another one who came on the cross much later, and he looked down on you and me, his enemies, by war in our nature, and he says, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. David is a good story. He's a good example of mercy, but he's not the power for it. You and I will always want to take that spear and ram it in the person's head. Doesn't that feel good? Until we see the one in Jesus who should have stamped us out, but he doesn't. Instead, with open arms on the cross, he says, come near to me again. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. The mercy of David is a great story. The mercy of Jesus is even better. And the mercy of Jesus this afternoon, if you start to ponder this and start to measure the gospel, saying that when he was on the cross, I was his enemy. And by rights, he was the king. But he lost his power so that I could get power. He lost his life so that I wouldn't get mine rubbed out. If you start to see Jesus looking at you and saying, you're precious. You are my enemy at times, but you're precious. And then, only then, I guarantee it, only then will you look at another person and say, you're precious. It's not easy to forgive. I'm not arguing that this afternoon. It would have cost David everything to show mercy, but he does it in the wilderness to his enemy, because he's just a shadow of the one who did it for you when he was driven outside the city and put up on a cross. He says, I'll have mercy for you. To be honest, I was going to give you this long story to close. I was going to try to wrap it up in bells and whistles to give you that ooh, ah moment. But I can't. Because I myself haven't gone to this place yet. And I myself know that it's the only the gospel that'll give me any sense of power to go to that place, to look at my enemies, the ones who've wronged me the most, and you have them in your life. If you don't, just wait, they'll come. And you say, I forgive you. I may not have forgotten it, but I'm not going to put the spear in the back of your head, because it wasn't put in mine. And I'm going to look at you and call you precious, because I was called precious in my darkest moments. There's a guy, Elie Wiesel, you probably have read him, a Holocaust survivor, wrote a wonderful book, a couple of them actually. And he goes through, of course, the Holocaust. He's in Auschwitz. He loses his mother and his sister when they were taken to the camps, and later on he lost his father. And he writes a book, and it's called Night. And it's about the first night that he went to the camps. And he says, never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things. Never. He said, I can't forget what they did to me. But sometime later he writes this as he got up to be an older man, and it's quite beautiful. And he's reflecting on the people that he's seen go to trial, the former SS guards, and the people who, he recognizes Eichmann, who he has a distant memory of this guy when he was on trial. And then later on he says, now I know who he was. He was the one who went to my town and rounded me up. But he goes on in a section on forgiveness. Remember, he says, I can't forget that night, which has turned my life into one long night. He recognizes the pain. He won't just seal it away. But then he comes back sometime later and he says, we must not see any person as an abstraction. Instead, we must see in every person a universe with its own secrets, with its own treasures, with its own sources of anguish, and with some measure of triumph. He had every right to look at those people and say they're evil. Get rid of them all. But he says we must not see people as an abstraction, but rather with some measure of triumph in them. These are his enemies. If anybody deserved to put the spear in them, it was him. He says, I will not see them as an abstraction, but I will see them with a measure of triumph. Now, do you see God looking at you and saying, I don't see you as an abstraction. I see you with triumph. My son's proof of it. When you know that, brothers and sisters, when the gospel becomes real and you know that Jesus looks down on that cross and he looks at you and he says, you're precious, not an abstraction. Then, and only then, can you look at others the same way. You'll be able to sing that song, Rock of Ages, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Naked come to thee for dress. Helpless look to thee for grace. Go to God now and say, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Naked come to thee for dress, and he dresses you. He gives you mercy. Go in prayer now. Reflect on this. Talk to God about this. Bring him your enemies and get rid of the spear forever.